Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Santita Jackson Show on AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. I am Santita Jackson. It's a joy to be with you here on the voice of progressive Minnesota, AM 950 Radio, and on the Santita Jackson Show YouTube channel. The Santita Jackson Show YouTube channel. Please like and subscribe us there. Click the bell so that you can get the notifications when we come on live. Like and subscribe, please, on the Santita Jackson Show YouTube channel, and click the bell, so that you can get notifications whenever we come on live. And, of course, you can meet me on the Santita Jackson and Friends Facebook page, Santita Jackson and Friends Facebook page. It is a joy to be with you today. I've got a very special guest. We're going to be talking about how we teach Black history. There's a controversy all over the country, but certainly in North Carolina. It seems that it was okay to talk about Black history until you illustrated it, until you had the black door and the white door. Whites enter here, blacks enter there. And then it became a game changer for the people of North Carolina. We've got to talk about how you teach Black history, because it's a very, very sensitive topic for everybody. But let's talk about Julian Assange, WikiLeaks founder, and all that he has done to change the game, this whistleblower. We would not know so much about how government actually works, what is going on in the world, were it not for him and his colleagues' work. And yet, now what we're dealing with really is a threat to his freedom and a threat to his life. And so one of our dear friends on this show, of course, from Defending Rights and Dissent, their policy director, Chip Gibbons, we're always so glad to have him with us. He is in the courtroom following the trial. And I want you to give us everything, give us a background. But first of all, what is the importance of this trial? What is the importance of Julian Assange before you tell us what's happening in London right now?
Sure. I mean, this has been called the press freedom trial of the 21st century, and that is no understatement. Julian Assange is the first time the United States government has charged a publisher of truthful information under the Espionage Act for the act of publishing newsworthy information. We've seen whistleblowers like Chelsea Manning or Daniel Ellsberg charged under the Espionage Act, and obviously my organization opposes that, but we've never seen them go after the journalist or the publisher, right? So they tried to put Dan Ellsberg in jail. They didn't put the New York Times on trial. They tried to put Edward Snowden in jail. He's in exile. They didn't put Glenn Greenwald and The Guardian and The Washington Post on trial. So this is the first time the U.S. has applied the Espionage Act to the journalist or to the publisher. So from a U.S. standpoint, this is pretty catastrophic for the future of press freedom. We're looking at the future of the First Amendment, but I'm here in London, and there are thousands of people out on the street today and the day before protesting the potential extradition of Julian Assange to the U.S. because this is about so much more than the United States. Julian Assange is not a U.S. citizen. WikiLeaks is not a U.S. publication. He is Australian. He operated in Europe. WikiLeaks, I believe, is based in Iceland. So we are saying that we can apply the Espionage Act not only to journalists, but to any journalist anywhere in the world, seize that person, bring them to this country, and put them in our prisons for publishing things we don't like. So this is a threat to press freedom everywhere. And, other countries look at what we're doing and cite this as an example. There was a Turkish journalist in the courtroom both days who was very famous for having exposed corruption by the Turkish government and was charged under a law like their Espionage Act. And Joe Biden, as vice president, opposed it, and all these U.S. officials spoke out against it. But the Turkish government said, wait a moment, this is what you do to Julian Assange. This is what you do to Chelsea Manning. Why is it wrong for us? And he really understands that connection. So we're potentially setting a precedent that is the death of the First Amendment, that allows the U.S. to go after any journalist in the world, and that will greenlight other governments to do the same.
So we're going after him. Why?
Sure. So that he faces 18 counts, 17 of which are brought under the Espionage Act. Obviously, WikiLeaks has released a lot of information But all of the charges, and many people don't realize this, all of the charges against him are from information he published with the New York Times, with The Guardian, with El País from 2010 to 2011. They are war logs from the Afghan war. They are war logs from the Iraq war. They are detainee assessment files, and they are State Department cables. This is not about the later CIA revelations. This is not about Hillary Clinton's emails. This is about the U.S. wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the military base at Guantanamo and a lot of really bad stuff the State Department did, including trying to bully the government of Haiti into not raising its minimum wage. And bombing Yemen and lying about it and having the government of Yemen take credit for the bombings. So really important information that was heralded at the time as newsworthy. And the editors of El País, the New York Times, The Guardian, I know I'm missing one, Der Spiegel perhaps, put out an unprecedented joint statement on the anniversary of the publishing of the State Department cable saying, we publish the same information. If Julian Assange can be charged for this, we could be too. So it is really very dangerous. And this is all information from, at this point, 14 years ago that was published that were about U.S. wars in the Middle East, that were in the public interest, that showed war crimes, that showed covering up war crimes, that showed dirty backroom deals with the State Department. This is not about the 2016 election. This is not about sexual assault allegations in Sweden or any of the other things you may have heard about Julian Assange. This is exclusively about publications that most people championed as a huge moment in the history of the press.
And yet Hillary Clinton has wanted him to be jailed, even extradited. Please explain.
So during the 2016 election, WikiLeaks did publish DNC emails. Hillary Clinton feels very strongly that contributed to the loss of her in the election. Other people don't share that perspective. It's worth pointing out that he's never faced criminal charges for that because Robert Mueller investigated this and decided there was no way to charge Julian Assange over the DNC emails without violating the First Amendment. And the DNC, Democratic National Committee, brought a lawsuit against WikiLeaks, and a judge threw out that lawsuit on First Amendment grounds. So not only is this not about the Hillary Clinton emails, a judge has ruled out a civil lawsuit, and Robert Mueller ruled out charging him over that, arguing that there was no way to do so without violating the First Amendment. So why are they coming for him here? That's a really great question. They're using the Espionage Act, which is this over 100-year-old law that is broad, archaic, unenforceable, basically unconstitutional, which talks about, quote unquote, national defense information. And you'll note I didn't say classified information because the law predates the classification system. That's how old it is. So they're arguing that he was involved in disclosing national defense information and that he somehow incited or aided and abetted Chelsea Manning to disclose national defense information. And this was the refrain we heard again and again from the prosecutors today. And I have to explain how weird this hearing is because it's British prosecutors, but they represent the U.S. government.
How does that work?
Under the extradition treaty, Britain has to pay our legal costs and give us lawyers to do this. So it is British prosecutors arguing on behalf of the government of the U.S. in Assange. The case is literally called Julian Paul Assange, Government v. of the United States. Sometimes you'll see it abbreviated in court documents, Assange v. America, but I refuse to call that because I'm an American and I'm not against journalism. That's something our government is doing that's not in line with our values, right? So the British prosecutors are representing us. And again, they kept making this case that Julian Assange is not a legitimate journalist because WikiLeaks as a website is illegitimate because it solicits people to give them information they shouldn't have and publishes information it's not supposed to be published. But journalists publish information as part of whistleblowing that the party who's having the whistle blown on them doesn't want published all the time, right? That's the entire purpose of journalism. But they make this case that because WikiLeaks was willing to publish this information and made it clear from the outset that if you had information in the public interest, they would publish it. They were somehow soliciting people to commit hacking, soliciting people to steal documents, soliciting people to break classification. Although, again, Julian Assange is not a U.S. citizen. He doesn't have a legal duty to protect the U.S. classification system.
But that's really odd, particularly ironic at this time when we see so many of our highest ranking officials, the presidents and the former then vice president, current president, who've walked away with classified documents. And
yeah,
still don't know how they're used.
It is very interesting as an espionage expert and someone who has known whistleblowers who have been indicted or imprisoned under the Espionage Act to look at what the special counsel said about Biden. And I would also argue Trump. I mean, Trump was indicted under the Espionage Act, but not for all of the documents he had, right? In this situation where he had documents that he returned to the government that was analogous to what Biden has allegedly done, he also walked away uncharged. He was only charged for those documents where he basically committed obstruction of justice. So with both Trump and Biden, you're allowed to retain classified information and get away with it. And, I don't terribly support the use of the Espionage Act in those cases, but the way the law has been written about, the way the law has been applied to whistleblowers, they say, okay, you are a government employee, which Trump and Biden both were. You were told that if you give classified information to the public or you retain it when you're not supposed to, you will harm the national security. Therefore, by doing this, you have reason to believe you're harming U.S. national security. Therefore, you are guilty under the Espionage Act. And they even apply this standard when the information was illegally or wrongfully classified, or when no harm occurred, or no one reasonably would have thought harm would have occurred, or when it's in the public interest. So when it comes to Trump and Biden, they've rediscovered that the Espionage Act has a barrier to prosecution. But when it comes to Daniel Hale or Chelsea Manning, they have a very low standard. So there's two systems of justice under the Espionage Act. Unfortunately, this becomes this Trump versus Biden thing when it's not about Trump versus Biden. It's about powerful people like Donald Trump, Joseph Biden, and David Petraeus versus whistleblowers like Chelsea Manning and journalists like Julian Assange.
What is Vault 7 and what happened with this WikiLeaks source they wanted to sentence him to a WikiLeaks source. They wanted to sentence him to 40 years, if not life in prison. Please explain.
They wanted to sentence him to life in prison. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison. 33 years and 6 months are for the Vault 7 charges. The remaining time, he had an unrelated child pornography conviction, which is a horrible crime, very horrendous, and I'm certainly not defending that. But he was sentenced to 33 years and 6 months in prison on the basis that he was convicted of giving WikiLeaks secret CIA hacking tools, which WikiLeaks then published information about how the CIA can turn on your electronic device and basically spy on you. The Joshua Schulte case, that's the name of the guy, has been very difficult for people like myself because Joshua Schulte has never claimed he was a whistleblower. He claims he's innocent and that he's been wrongfully accused of this. He also at one point said the person who leaked this information should be executed. So he's not part of the whistleblower press freedom community. And again, the first time the government put him on trial, there was a hung jury on the charges of giving Vault 7 to WikiLeaks. Then he represented himself in court, which you should probably never do. You especially shouldn't do that if you're charged under the Espionage Act. and the government won when he represented himself, when he had no lawyer, which was his choice to do that. I don't think it was probably a very good choice. But the government sought a life sentence for him, arguing that he was not like other people convicted under Section 793 of the Espionage Act. That's the part that has been applied to Dan Ellsberg and Julian Assange, but that he was more like people who were convicted under Section 794 of the Espionage Act. That's the part that covers actual espionage, but that he legally couldn't be charged under that portion because he didn't give the information to a foreign government. That's a very abusive argument for the government to make. I mean, the allegations against Schulte is that he was angry at workplace discipline. He had gotten into like a fist fight over rubber bands or Nerf guns or something very, I mean, again, they always try to spread derogatory information about these people, but it doesn't really bode well on the CIA if he was working there. And that he was retaliating against the government by giving this information to WikiLeaks out of spite, which is different than what Manning or Snowden or Ellsberg did, where they gave information to the media out of conscience. And they also received this terrorism enhancement against him. So the Espionage Act doesn't carry a terrorism enhancement, but the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which he was also charged under, which Julian Assange is also charged with conspiring to violate, is considered a federal crime of terrorism if you do so to coerce or retaliate against the U.S. government. And his lawyers argued that he wasn't accused of any political motivation. He was just angry at his job situation. And the judge, so therefore he wasn't, coercing or retaliating against the U.S. government. And a judge found that he had committed a crime of terrorism. But if you stop and think about it for a minute, anyone who gives information to the media to influence government policy under this scheme is now committed a federal crime of terrorism. So the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, it covers sort of unauthorized use of a computer intrusion. I don't know as much about it as I know about the Espionage Act, but it's one of those very broad laws we have on the books. And it covers something that in the name of, we think, okay, computer intrusion, computer fraud, that's really bad. There should be a law against this, like there should be a law against espionage. But then it turns out it's an extremely broad law that covers a bunch of otherwise innocuous acts. And the idea that this could be a federal crime of terrorism is really very troubling. And it bodes very poorly for Julian Assange's case, because he also is charged with conspiring to violate the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. And the government sought an extension of the statute of limitations, arguing it was a federal crime of terrorism. So we can expect them to try to seek this same sort of enhancement against Julian Assange if he's brought to this country and convicted.
Then what is the fear? Because there is not just a reluctance. I mean, his supporters, his wife, and everyone who supports him, no one wants him brought to the United States. What is the fear of him being brought to the United States?
Well, we have to remember the U.S. government hates him, right? They despise him. We know the FBI has had an active investigation into him since October 2010. We know that when the Obama administration, which prosecuted a lot of whistleblowers wrongfully, refused to prosecute him, the CIA and the FBI demanded a personal meeting with President Obama. We know that the CIA under Donald Trump considered kidnapping him, and that the kidnapping plots were so serious that people on the Trump National Security Council got concerned that they were illegal. Right? When the CIA is doing things or talking about things that are so illegal, the National Security Council is concerned. It's troubling. And when it's the Trump National Security Council, which did not have, a strong human rights impulse, it's even more troubling. And we also know they talked about, but didn't seriously consider, or they didn't go through with it, drawing up a plan to assassinate him and to poison him, and that they had spies in the Ecuadorian embassy where he was trapped who were feeding information, who were spying on his legal meetings. And there was this CIA plot that if he ever tried to leave the embassy, they would chase, because they thought the Russian government could try to get him out the embassy, which Julian Assange denies. He never had any desire to go to Russia. He's rejected any sort of, but they thought, what if the Russians sort of get him out the embassy? They were prepared to have a shootout on the streets of London with a Russian car, which would be an act of war. And then they had this plan that if they got to the airport, they would shoot the tires of the plane out with snipers. So that's the extent the CIA was willing to go to get this guy. And there's no way he can get a fair trial in the United States, where our intelligence agencies have spied on him, plotted to kidnap him, and seriously considered killing him. On top of that, I think there is a lot of concern, even amongst those who feel these charges are unconstitutional, that the way the court system works and the jury system works, that he will be found guilty and he will spend a lot of time in prison. In theory, he could face 175 years in prison. That's very unlikely that anybody ever gets the full sentence on each of the charges, but that's the maximum sentence for the 17 Espionage Act, 1 conspiracy to commit computer intrusion charges. The prosecution has been telling the UK courts he's unlikely to do, more than 6 years, because no whistleblower or journalist or anyone under the Espionage Act has ever been sentenced to more than that, except for Chelsea Manning, but that was in a military court, not a civilian court. But then just 2 weeks ago, the government asked for a life sentence against someone who gave information to WikiLeaks, sort of treating WikiLeaks as analogous to a foreign government that's hostile. So based on what they did to Joshua Schulte, who I think is a different person than Julian Assange and a different person than whistleblowers, I'm really concerned about the type of sentence the government would seek against him. I don't think it's going to be 6 years. I think it's going to be life or 30 or 40.
Or then some. I mean, what's the difference between this case and the Chelsea Manning case and the Ed Snowden case? Or are they really in one basket? I mean, these are people who saw our government committing wrongs, and our government that's supposed to be of, for, and by us. They work for us, Chip Gibbons. We're talking with Chip Gibbons, Policy Director for Defending Rights and Dissent, here on AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota, and the Santita Jackson Show YouTube channel. Like and subscribe to everybody. Click the bell so you can get notified when we come on live. Chelsea Manning, Ed Snowden, Julian Assange, Daniel Ellsberg. I mean, these are people who saw something that was clearly illegal. Or certainly, these are acts at the American people with which we would take umbrage, and yet they're being put on the rack. I mean, am I misreading things? It seems that whistleblowers are in more danger today than they have been in a very long time.
You're absolutely correct. When Dan Ellsberg was charged, and Anthony Russo, who was accused of conspiring with him, when they were charged under the Espionage Act, they were the first 2 whistleblowers charged under the Espionage Act. And between Dan Ellsberg and about 2010, only 1 government insider was ever charged under the Espionage Act for the crime of giving information to the media. He was convicted under the Reagan administration. It was considered such a bizarre thing to do. Bill Clinton pardoned him. So these types of prosecutions used to be non-existent, and they were considered extremely rare and extremely anomalous when they happened. But now the Espionage Act is the go-to weapon of the government when someone is a whistleblower in the national security space.
But what is the Espionage Act, and why is it used primarily against Eugene Debs, all the people on the left? I mean, historically, the Espionage Act, people have been charged with trying to overthrow the government, betray the public trust. They're always on the left. They're never people who are considered to be war criminals the world over.
Well, the Espionage Act was passed during World War I. It was used to prosecute people like Eugene Debs, who opposed the war. It was used during the Vietnam War era to prosecute Dan Ellsberg, who opposed the Vietnam War. It was revived during the War on Terror to prosecute people who expose war crimes, torture, mass surveillance. You see
But you see the through line, right?
the through line. Yeah, there is a through line from Eugene Debs to Julian Assange. I mean, they're indicted under different parts of the Espionage Act. The Espionage Act is a broad law that encompasses a bunch of different conduct, but there is a through line between putting Eugene Debs in prison. This is literally what he said. They got him thrown in prison. If war be right, let the people declare it. And putting, Julian Assange in jail, who believes if wars can be started by lies, then peace can be started by truth.
What is happening in London right now? I mean, because there is not a lot of daylight between the United States and the UK. I mean, there's just the special relationship. We are together on just about everything in the world today.
So in 2019, the U.S. uncovered an indictment against Assange, and the British police arrested him for bail hopping in London initially, but they've been holding him for 5 years since then because of the U.S. extradition request against him. In 2021, a judge in the UK ruled that Assange could not be extradited to the U.S. In doing so, she denied all of the defense's press freedom and political freedom arguments, the ones that most people who follow this case think about, but found because prison conditions in the U.S. were so terrible and Julian Assange's mental health was so precarious that if he was extradited to this country, it would be oppressive to him. Since then, a court has overturned her decision to block extradition based on mental health, prisoners' rights, oppressive conditions grounds. The UK prosecutors, acting on behalf of the US, appealed the decision and won. So now the defense has appealed the other part of her decision, blocking the press freedom, blocking the political offenses questions. And for the last 2 days, the High Court, and you're going to love this, held a 2-day hearing on whether or not Julian Assange should be allowed to appeal. Right? It's not even technically it's an appeal. It is a hearing about whether or not he has arguable points to appeal. If you spend 2 days listening to appeal arguments, I call that an appeal, but the UK system's a bit strange. If they reject his right to appeal, it is his final court hearing in the United States, and then a race will start to put him on a plane to the US before the European Court of Human Rights could intervene. His lawyers are prepared to go to the European Court of Human Rights, which is not part of the EU. It's part of a different part of the Council of Europe and is binding on the UK. But there is fear they would try to sneak him on a plane before he could even file that appeal, in which case there's no getting him back. I think legally his best recourse is with the European Court in Strasbourg. But I do think that some of the arguments the prosecution have made are so out there that I would like to think a judge would pause. A lot of this turns, we're at a very technical legal level at this level of appeal, but a lot of this turns on the fact that the US-UK extradition treaty, like almost every other extradition treaty in the world, says you cannot extradite someone for a political offense. And if you open a law textbook up, it says espionage, sedition, treason are political offenses. We're charging him under the Espionage Act. But the UK prosecutors are arguing, and I'm not enough of an expert in UK law to make this make any more sense, that because of a 2003 extradition law passed, that's not an enforceable part of the treaty. So even though the treaty says you cannot do this, it's just language out there, and a judge can't enforce it. And Julian Assange's lawyers are arguing that a judge can enforce this, and that the charges against him are fundamentally political in nature. I would like to hope that the British courts would not throw out the plain language of the treaty and the way extradition has worked for 100 years just to help the U.S. get this one guy. It's worth pointing out that the U.S.-UK extradition treaty has been very controversial in the past because the U.S. courts refused to extradite suspected IRA members. And Margaret Thatcher got very angry, and they wanted Ronald Reagan to rip up the treaty. And do you know who was very angry about that? Senator Joe Biden, because he's Irish. Obviously, that's why he was angry about that. But he was all for defending the political offenses exception. And in the 80s, when people were talking about limiting that right in the U.S. UK extradition treaty, people in this country got very angry because there's a large Irish American community, and they didn't like what the British were doing to the Irish, and they didn't want us extraditing Irish people to England to stand trial.
We're talking with Chip Gibbons, Policy Director, Defending Rights and Dissent. He is in London in the courtroom where they are seeking to prosecute Julian Assange. He's right there. Is he being treated fairly? Number one, how is he doing? We've heard some very disturbing reports about him being in poor health.
So Julian was granted the right to appear in person in court for the first time in 4 or 5 years. In the past, he's been denied that right. He was only allowed to appear on a video link. The last time he appeared in court, they had him in a giant glass box. He was in a cage in the courtroom, which I hear is standard in the UK. In the US, that would never fly because of the presumption of innocence. You cannot put an uncharged, unconvicted person in a giant cage where their lawyers can't talk to them during a proceeding. He did not show up to court either today or yesterday or for the 2 days of the hearings because he was in such ill health. He has a broken rib. He has a bad cough from a respiratory issue. And the fact that Julian Assange has fought so hard to show up in court and didn't shows how serious his illness is.
How does he have a broken rib, Chip?
I don't know. I wonder that myself. I don't know all the medical details. I believe he has osteoporosis.
Yeah.
But again, I'm not a medical doctor. I'm not his medical doctor.
Sure.
I just know what's been reported. I had the exact same thought you had. I know what you're thinking, and I also had that thought. Yes. How do you get a broken rib in prison?
I'm just asking. I'm going to bring up Dwight McKee before you go. Dwight McKee, from who you have talked to before, he was very involved in the Fred Hampton case. The day after Fred Hampton was murdered, he and Mark Clark, he and a group of people from Operation Breadbasket, Reverend Jesse Jackson's organization, went looking for Bobby Rush, who was the most wanted man in America, right? And so, because they were clear that if the FBI got him, they would kill him. Very quickly before Chip has to go and gives us a final word, because everybody in the world wants Chip, and I'm so glad that we were able to get a little time with him today, a lot of time with him. Thank you for that. Dwight, what is your comment, given your experience with the FBI, with the CIA, in the civil rights movement, and just fighting for freedom? What do you see?
Well, first, let me commend Chip. It was a very comprehensive analysis that you've given. This is one of the most despicable cases in the history of America, what they're doing to Assange. They are the biggest threat to democracy that one government could be, because his basic charge is telling the truth. And the thing that got him really, really in trouble is when he ran that expose on them killing those 5 civilians for target practice. They just assassinated them. And then they laughed about doing it. Once he published that, it was over for him. It's not about national security, it's about national insecurity. Is they insecure about him telling the truth, as would any liar be about the truth. And most of these policies, many of these wars, much of the foreign policy is built upon lie, upon lie, upon lie, upon lie. And so when you have somebody who has the mechanism to get the truth out, by definition, he becomes the biggest threat to that military interests and their political interests, because the people don't really want you to know the truth. That what they're actually doing is that they're doing much of the illegal activity. They're doing much of the assassination and murder. They're doing much of the uh, illegal things that they know. They know that if they were put on trial for, many of them would be in jail today. And so these are really our heroes, the Daniel Ellsbergs, the Julian Assange. They're the closest thing we have to trying to maintain the integrity of democracy on the planet.
Mm.
And if we don't support them, we may as well pack it in and say that, that we just are um, uh, succumb to whatever the state decides to do in our behalf with our tax money.
So,
My experience with the FBI is coming out of the civil rights movement. We saw the FBI as the arch enemy and thought they were complicit not just in President Kennedy's assassination, Bobby Kennedy's assassination, Dr. King's assassination, Fred Hampton's assassination. We saw the CIA and the FBI as killing machines and would do anything they could do to maintain the status quo of America, and not the America, the broad America, my country tis of thee, but a certain group in America that was exploiting the resources around the world. They were trying to maintain power for themselves at anybody's expense, including the expense of other Americans.
well, Forbes magazine just came out with an article in which they criticized the FBI for taking the personal properties of Americans. I know you've got to go, Chip. What do you want us to know? And for those of us who are so inclined, is there anything we can do to support Julian Assange, his wife? Is there anything that Americans can do to keep him from being extradited here?
Yeah, I'm going to say two things. First of all, we're going to get the FBI file of the informant who helped to kill Fred Hampton. Defending Rights of Dissent is currently suing the FBI to have that file released, and we will get it released and we will get it published. In terms of helping Julian Assange, contact your member of Congress. You would be surprised how little people in Congress know about this issue. There's a resolution in Congress right now calling for Assange to be freed. You could ask your member to co-sponsor that. You could ask them to co-sponsor upcoming legislation to reform the Espionage Act, or just to speak out and put pressure on the Biden administration, because this is a political prosecution. So the decision to drop it will be political, right? The prosecutors like to say this is all about law. Politics have no place here, but this is purely political. The decision to prosecute him was political, and the decision to end this will be political as well. So raise your voice and let your member of Congress know that you want this dropped. You want press freedom defended.
And Chip, you be careful, because what you all are doing is tremendously courageous and tremendously dangerous. So you all will be in our prayers and be ever vigilant on this, because you all are really at risk in this situation.
And we will put you on this show as often as we can, because as long as you have spotlight on you, that gives you safety. That gives you safe harbor, because we don't know what's happening with Julian Assange. It endangers him, because we've not seen his wife. He's endangered just because, having a high profile, while it gives you high risks, it also, you become too hot to touch. So know that you have a home here, and all you need to do is send me a text, give me a phone call, and you have a home here. Thank God for the work that you're doing, and our love to his family.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to join you tonight. Have a good one.
God bless. Be well.
Thank you.
Dwight McKee, it just doesn't stop.
No, evil does not stop, Santita. And that's why men of goodwill can't stop either, because evil is ever before us. And
what do you make of this case? I mean, it seems like there's a real attack upon press freedom. The only press that we get freely, Dwight, is corporate media. But when you want to tell the truth, I mean, first of all, pundits who want to be truthful can't get on TV, not on corporate media. Um, Whistleblowers are being punished almost as never before. I mean, they have no cover. Ed Snowden is in Russia, for God's sakes. That's where he is now because he has no space. Chelsea Manning was treated horrifically. She was treated horrifically in prison. And I just, how does this continue, Dwight?
It continues because the elite here own so much of the means of production. They control so much of the media. They control so much of the messaging. And this country, this present government, in fact, the last few governments could not survive with the truth, because in many things what they're doing themselves is so illegal and so diabolical that the last thing a roach wants is a spotlight. These guys like Assange, I really, really, I find remarkable because they're literally willing to put their lives on the line to get real information out, and most of them had to pay a price for that. It's the most tremendous exercise in a commitment to justice that you will find in in these people. And rather than them get the Nobel Prize, which many of them really should be up to, they end up either in jail, banished, or literally assassinated.
Well, maybe that's not the mission of the Nobel Prize, right? Because that's not who they support.
No, that's correct. And so I think that we should, at least those of us who are committed to truth, have to keep lifting up their message and keep presenting them as the heroes that they are, so that we can bring balance to the narrative. And as Chip said, keep putting the political pressure on our congressmen to do the right thing. Because I think, as we found out with Ellsberg, as the people understand and see the truth, the reality of what they're dealing with, then their own values kick in, and they start applying political pressure to do things like stop the Vietnam War, or to do things like make sure that My Lai is dealt with.
Well, Dwight, hold on, because they become intersectional. We forget that Daniel Ellsberg was an establishment figure, right? And he saw the wrongs that were being committed and said, wait a minute, this is not right. Ed Snowden was an establishment figure. They pulled him out of schools because he had such a brilliant, technologically brilliant mind. But he got in and said, wait a minute, you all are committing injustices. That's what happened to Chelsea Manning. These are people who start off inside the system, Dwight. And then they see injustice and they, as Americans, say, okay, it's my duty to present the malfeasances of the government, the things that they're doing wrong. And when they do it, you get put in jail. Chelsea Manning was tortured. Ed Snowden is chased out of America. I don't even know if he's an American citizen anymore. And look at Julian Assange. He's not even an American citizen. And as Chip said, WikiLeaks is an Icelandic company. It's not even an American company, Dwight.
And as I remember, Daniel Ellsberg worked for the Pentagon.
That's why he was a salesman.
And the papers he took were actual Pentagon papers. They were actually government papers that just confessed or demonstrated those things the government had done that were found to be illegal. So it's not like he was manufacturing information, or not like he was are being fed information by spies from Russia. These were the Pentagon Papers themselves that he took and made public. And so, yeah, at some levels, you almost have to be on the inside to have access to what's really going on.
So I mean, so where do we go from here? I mean, what do we do when we see what's happening to Julian Assange? I mean, we were told, and we should be calling our congresspersons to say, hey, uh, we don't want him extradited here. Free Julian Assange, because he would not be safe here. But he's not safe anywhere, quite frankly, Dwight. He's not safe. And that's what's so heartbreaking about all of this. I don't know how he got a cracked rib, Dwight.
Well, I think that the left should make it part of the policy, a precondition for their voting for
The Democrats.
Democrats and for Biden. Just like they're making ceasefire a precondition, just like some of them are making the environment a precondition. I think that these issues of espionage really reach to that kind of level and need to be dealt with that kind of way, because ultimately the only protection that we have for democracy is the whistleblowers, the truth tellers. And while they talk about that the greatest risk to democracy is Donald Trump and the radical Republicans, that's not true. The biggest risk to democracy are those people who want lies to prevail rather than the truth, whatever side of the political perspective spectrum that they're on.
And you see it on the so-called right and the so-called left. What does Reverend Jackson say? You know, they're two wings of the same plane. You know, so did you see? I only have about 4 or 5 minutes left here. Did you see any of this in your activities in the 60s and the 70s in the civil rights movement?
That's all we saw in the 60s and the 70s. We knew that in some ways, that every counter movement that we had, that was part of it was facilitated by the CIA or the FBI. That even the Ku Klux Klan was being manipulated in many ways by the FBI, the CIA, the local businesses. I mean, the local law enforcement was being manipulated by the CIA and the FBI. Once Hoover declared Dr. King as the most dangerous Negro in America, the most dangerous man in America, he became a legitimate enemy of the state.
So what?
And so,
when you become an enemy of the state, got about 3 minutes. What does that mean?
Then they use all their resources, legal or illegal, to neutralize you. Whatever neutralize means for them. Whether it's to put you in jail like the political prisoners from the Panthers, whether to assassinate you, whether to assassinate your character, they will operate by any means necessary to take you out. I remember meeting with Hanrahan, who had led the raid on Fred Hampton.
He was the state's attorney in Illinois at the time, in Cook County.
I had him come to my youth division meeting. And he said to us at the meeting, he said,
I want people to know what you're talking about.
He said at the meeting,
Operation Breadbasket at that time.
At the meeting, he said, he was running for mayor at the time. He said, we asked him about them Fred Hampton. He said, the FBI manipulated me. I on my own would not have done that, but they manipulated me. And they set me up for this assassination. He told us that. Then he looked and said, are there any cameras here, any tapes here? Turn them all out. I could never say that publicly. But this was an assassination by the FBI. They just used me and the Chicago police to carry out their will.
How did that work? I've got 90 seconds. How did that work?
How did that work?
Yeah, how did they do
They
that?
fed information to to him. He didn't go into a lot of great detail, but they fed information to him, created this aura that Fred Hampton was a potential killer, temple assassination. Gave them a blueprint. Had a spy that gave them a blueprint and said if they didn't go in with all guns blazing, that Fred Hampton had an arsenal in there, and Chicago police would get killed if they didn't go in with guns blazing out front. And so what they do is they feed, they master misinformation and they master intrigue. And the way they broke the Panthers up is that they fed misinformation from one to another about affairs that they were having with each other's wives, created dissension, and ultimately had them, shooting at each other. It's they operate in that old tradition of divide and conquer that the British perfected.
Stay right there. We have a lot to discuss. Go to Defending Rights and Dissent, and follow their coverage of the Julian Assange trial. Please reach out to your congressman and let them know that you want Julian Assange freed. We want press freedom in America. We need it desperately. Coming up, let us talk in the second hour on the Santita Jackson Show about how you teach Black history. It seems there's a controversy in North Carolina. Let's talk about it. Whenever you make it real, whenever you illustrate it, it becomes a problem. Back with more of the Santita Jackson Show on AM 950 Radio and the YouTube channel, the Santita Jackson Show YouTube channel. Back in just a minute.